You're looking at a barren desert in the United Arab Emirates. Scorching sun, endless piles of sand, and jagged rocks cutting across the horizon. In short, it's the kind of place where almost no one would even want to be. But the UAE had other plans. Right here, in the middle of this burned-out wasteland, the authorities are building a port that'll cover a massive area. Yes, there isn't a single natural water source around, but they're putting in all the infrastructure needed to handle large ships. And here's the key point. The UAE is seriously betting that this port in the sand could help free the country from its dependence on the Strait of Hormuz. It sounds like some kind of insane plan, but let's take a closer look at what's really going on. We're looking at the Emirate of Sharjah, more specifically a place called Al Thid. It lies deep inland. Out here, there's nothing but sun-scorched desert, and yet this is exactly where they've decided to bury billions of dollars. The entire project covers about 247 acres, and in the middle of the sand, vast stretches of land will be paved over with ultra-durable concrete for one simple purpose: to stack tens of thousands of heavy shipping containers. Steel tracks will be added as well, carrying massive cranes as tall as apartment buildings, moving these metal boxes back and forth around the clock. But the climate in Al Thid is brutal. In summer, temperatures in direct sunlight regularly push 122 degrees Fahrenheit. Any sensitive cargo, medicine, food, or perishables could spoil in just a couple of hours. That's why engineers have built huge refrigerated terminals into the project. These facilities will run on powerful standalone systems, keeping the inside cold while the ground outside practically melts. And right in the middle of the dunes, they're also building administrative facilities for full-scale border and customs posts. In other words, international cargo control will take place literally out in the sands. It sounds ambitious, but the core problem remains. This place is truly isolated. There's one important detail, though. The UAE has been preparing this desert for a port for a long time. As it turned out, Al Thid isn't some dead-end town lost among the dunes. It's a genuine logistics crossroads, a place from which you can reach the country's key metropolitan hubs in about an hour. Running straight through it is the powerful federal highway E88. Along this route, huge volumes of freight can move toward Sharjah and Dubai without getting caught in a single traffic jam, carefully bypassing residential neighborhoods. Another major artery, the E55 highway, cuts through the region from north to south. It connects the port with the Northern Emirates and continues down toward Abu Dhabi. At the same time, the area around Al Thid is already seeing major upgrades. Interchanges are being rebuilt and large new industrial access roads are being added, giving trucks room to disperse in all directions. But asphalt's only half the story. The most ambitious part of this entire network is taking shape right now: Al Thid's integration into the national Etihad rail system. They're not just laying tracks here for freight trains, they're designing a full-scale major transport hub. And this is where the scale becomes truly international. The railway's being built with the long-term goal of linking the UAE's entire network with Saudi Arabia. In other words, a container unloaded in Al Thid could eventually travel by train deep into the Arabian Peninsula without a single stop. But flawless roads and modern rail lines are still only the physical shell of the project. The real trick isn't the tons of concrete, it's the legal paperwork. The Emirati authorities plan to give this site in Al Thid a unique legal status. Under government decrees, a full-fledged free economic zone will be created here, complete with its own sovereign customs area. In simple terms, officials are taking the country's border, along with its international checkpoints, and moving them from the coast deep inland into the middle of lifeless dunes. To put that in context, in normal logistics, any cargo entering a country has to go through strict controls at the point where it crosses the border, usually the seaport. That's where documents are checked, containers are opened, duties are calculated, and only then is the cargo released into the country. It's a slow process, and it often creates massive bottlenecks along the coast, where there simply isn't enough space to inspect thousands of containers. But in Al Thid, the rules of the game change completely. All official clearance, customs declarations, phytosanitary inspections, and paperwork will be handled here, out in the sand. On top of that, free zone status gives businesses huge tax advantages. Companies will be able to bring in goods from all over the world, store them in vast warehouses, repackage them or distribute them onward without paying import duties or taxes at all. On paper, this stretch of desert becomes a special part of the country. Legally, the project fully replicates the functions of a coastal port, erasing the difference between the shoreline and the heart of the mainland. So yes, it sounds impressive, but why build something this ambitious out in the desert in the first place? After all, the UAE already has coastal locations that can handle cargo without passing through the Strait of Hormuz. There they are, Fujairah and Khor Fakkan, both accessible directly from the Gulf of Oman. So why the desert? Both of these ports are true strategic heavyweights. Khor Fakkan is one of the largest deepwater ports in the region, capable of handling massive ocean-going container ships. Its maximum designed capacity is an impressive 5 million containers a year. The port of Fujairah is no small player either. It has a modern container hub that serves as a key logistics node for the region, with a throughput capacity of up to 720,000 containers a year, which allows it to process major cargo flows quickly and efficiently. But here's the catch. When tensions around the Strait of Hormuz reached a breaking point in 2026, this entire colossal cargo flow suddenly came rushing here. The world's largest shipping lines began canceling routes into the Persian Gulf through the Strait of Hormuz and redirecting their vessels to the UAE's east coast. The pressure on the terminals grew at an explosive pace. In short bursts, Fujairah was handling around 70,000 containers, and remember, its annual capacity is 720,000 containers. As for Khor Fakkan, at one point its container flow jumped from 2,000 a week to 50,000. That's roughly a 25-fold increase. Instead of operating on a normal scheduled rhythm, the port switched into round-the-clock emergency mode, working 24/7 as they tried to absorb record volumes of cargo that had previously been spread across the entire country. But if so much cargo was coming in, why not simply expand the docks and warehouses at the ports themselves? That's exactly the problem. On the East Coast, it's physically almost impossible. Look at Fujairah or Khor Fakkan on satellite images, and you'll see that they're trapped by geography. On one side, there's deep ocean water. On the other, just a few hundred feet behind the terminals and quay walls, the Al Hajar Mountains rise sharply from the coast. There's virtually no flat, open coastal land left. To expand the port zone, you'd either have to spend years blasting through millions of tons of solid rock or build extremely expensive artificial islands. This is where the idea behind the Al Udeid port really starts to make sense. The logic is simple. Since the mountains leave almost no room on the coast to store, sort, and clear millions of containers through customs, the coastal port should function purely as transit points. Take the container off the ship and move it away from the waterfront immediately. All the slow, routine paperwork, customs clearance, sorting, and storage can be moved inland to the desert, where there's almost unlimited space. This inland hub becomes the region's lungs, saving the overcrowded coast from logistical suffocation. But one key question remains. How do you physically move millions of heavy containers from the jammed coastline to an inland port? After all, there's no waterway connecting them. Well, at least there are highways. But things always look easier on paper than they do in real life. The real pressure falls on the routes through the mountains. But it's not exactly as if those roads were built to handle it. A single large container ship can bring as many as 20,000 to 24,000 containers into port. To unload just one of those vessels and move all those boxes inland, you'd need the same number of truck trips, 20,000 to 24,000 of them. So when cargo flows were urgently rerouted to Fujairah and Khor Fakkan, road traffic increased dozens of times over. And of course, that means serious congestion. Exactly the kind of thing logistics operators hate. Sending freight along those same roads to the dry port in Al Udeid would hardly be a great solution, and this is where the UAE pulled out its trump card, the massive national railway project known as Etihad Rail. Back in 2023, the country completed a truly colossal piece of infrastructure. Engineers quite literally cut straight through the Al Hajar mountain range. Construction crews blasted through millions of tons of rock and carved 9 extremely complex mountain tunnels through solid granite with a combined length of about 4.3 miles. So the rail links from the 2 coastal ports to the inland port in Al Udeid are already in place. Here's how the system's supposed to work. Instead of putting more strain on truck drivers and clogging up mountain passes, containers are loaded directly at the ports onto huge freight trains. A single train more than half a mile long and pulled by powerful diesel locomotives can carry up to 100 standard containers in one trip. That instantly takes up to 100 trucks off the highways. The train then races through the mountain tunnels at full speed, completely unaffected by traffic jams, and carries the cargo deep inland. Ultimately, it's the perfect logistics model. A ship docks at the coastal port, a train takes the containers inland through the mountains, and in the desert of Al Udeid, they're processed, cleared, and sorted at a much more controlled pace. But for this system to work at maximum efficiency, ordinary freight trains wouldn't be enough. Given the scale of the crisis and the sheer volume of cargo, standard trains simply wouldn't be able to handle the logistics flow, and running dozens of short trains around the clock would be inefficient and expensive. No one would rush to build additional rail lines through the mountains in an emergency either. That's why even during the design phase for certain sections, Emirati engineers placed their bets on an advanced double-stack container system. For the Middle East, this was a major first, since systems like this had previously been used mostly on ultra-long transcontinental routes in the United States or Australia. The concept is simple, but extremely effective. Instead of placing containers on rail cars in a single layer, they're stacked one on top of another, too high. On paper, it sounds like building with blocks. In reality, though, this solution forced the designers of the Etihad rail line to rethink traditional engineering standards and construction regulations from the ground up. The biggest technical challenge was the mountainous terrain. To allow a fully loaded extra-heavy train to pass safely and smoothly through the Al Hajar Mountains, builders had to design all 9 mountain tunnels with higher clearances from the very beginning. Their arches were made significantly taller than those of a typical railway corridor. On top of that, the dimensions of a double-stack train required specially designed, reinforced overhead contact systems and other dedicated infrastructure capable of handling enormous loads while maintaining uninterrupted operation with trains of non-standard height. In the end, this approach delivered a major boost to the efficiency of the entire logistics chain. Double-stack technology increased the railway's carrying capacity without the need to lay additional tracks, and that makes it almost perfectly suited to the route between the East Coast and the inland dry port in Al Thid. But the story of Arab engineering ingenuity didn't stop there. When you have a massive train hauling an enormous number of containers along the tracks, the load on the railway is tremendous. Now add the Emirates' brutal climate to the equation, where sleepers and rails have to survive shifting sand dunes and extreme heat. A standard railway would simply fall apart here within a couple of months. That meant the engineers had to build the rail line according to rigorous standards. Let's start with weight. To keep the tracks from sinking under double-stack freight trains, the entire Etihad rail network was designed to handle a massive axle load of 32.5 tons. The rails themselves are continuous welded rails, meaning they were joined using a special welding method to form one long, seamless line. This isn't just for a smoother ride, it also prevents the heavy wheels from hammering the joints and gradually destroying the track bed. But that immediately brings us to problem number 2, temperature. In the desert summer, metal exposed to direct sunlight can heat up to 140 to 158 degrees Fahrenheit, then cool down again at night. With temperature swings like that, ordinary rails can start twisting and buckling into waves, which could easily cause a train to derail. To prevent this, the tracks were laid using a clever technique. The rails were pre-tensioned with hydraulic jacks and welded only at a specific neutral temperature. This creates a controlled internal stress inside the metal. As a result, the rails don't expand too much in the heat or contract so much at night that they start to pull apart. And of course, the biggest enemy of trains in the UAE is something very simple: sand. Strong winds constantly move millions of tons of sand across the desert. If sand clogs the crushed stone ballast under the sleepers, the track loses its resilience, and if a dune simply creeps onto the rails, the train can get stuck. To protect the railway, engineers turned to aerodynamics. In many desert sections, the tracks were built on high embankments with specially angled slopes. When the wind hits an embankment like that, it speeds up and flows over it, carrying the sand farther away instead of letting it settle on the rails. In the most difficult areas, they also installed protective walls and sand traps. So, in short, the UAE clearly managed to turn this transport artery into a fully functioning, well-engineered system. But the Arabs decided not to stop at their own borders. They looked at the map on a bigger scale and realized that bypassing the Strait of Hormuz would only truly work if neighboring Oman became part of the system as well. That's how the International Hafit Rail Project came into being. It's an official joint venture between the UAE's Etihad Rail and Oman Rail. The project used to be known simply as the Oman Etihad Rail Company, but a couple of years ago it was given a new name in honor of Jebel Hafit, a mountain located right on the border between the two countries. This section of railway will stretch for about 148 miles. It will connect the major industrial port of Sohar in Oman with the UAE's national rail network near the city of Al Ain. The line will carry both passenger trains and powerful freight trains capable of reaching speeds of up to 75 miles per hour. A single train will be able to move more than 100 standard containers at once, or thousands of tons of bulk cargo such as steel and construction materials. Right now, in 2026, the railway is still under active construction. In other words, trains are not running on it yet, and the line is not officially opened, but work is moving ahead at full speed. Contracts with major construction companies were signed in 2024, and crews are now busy leveling the land, building bridges, preparing embankments, and laying the first sections of track. According to the builder's plans, the line is expected to connect the two countries within the next few years. Now let's see what this major project in Oman has to do with the dry port in Al Thid. As it turns out, the connection is very direct. Oman's Sohar port is a huge, modern, deepwater hub. Most importantly, it's also located on the coast of the Gulf of Oman, meaning it sits outside the risky Strait of Hormuz. Once a feet rail is completed and linked to the UAE's wider rail network, the dry port in Al Thid will gain a powerful alternative corridor for imports and exports. Imagine this scenario. Another crisis breaks out at sea, and the ports of Fujairah and Khor Fakkan start struggling under a sudden surge of ships. At that moment, ship owners get a legitimate plan B. A vessel sails a little farther south, unloads in Sohar, Oman, and the containers are immediately transferred onto trains. From there, they move by rail across the border straight into the UAE. These goods can then move smoothly along the unified railway network to the Al Thid hub, where they can be efficiently distributed. That gives logistics companies an incredible amount of flexibility. Shipping routes could be adjusted while vessels are still at sea, depending on how crowded the docks are along the coast. At the same time, Oman and the UAE are planning to introduce customs clearance and digital cargo tracking, so trains won't have to sit for hours at the border and can instead pass through quickly. As a result, a dry port in the middle of the desert becomes a central hub capable of handling cargo from both the UAE's east coast and neighboring Oman. The risk of delays caused by geopolitics drops to a minimum, while the entire logistics system gains a massive extra layer of resilience. But even that's not the whole story, because this international project is part of an even bigger vision, one that spans the entire peninsula. This is the Gulf Railway Project. Calling it ambitious would be an understatement. The idea is to connect all 6 member states of the Gulf Cooperation Council with a single rail network. This includes Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Qatar, the UAE, and Oman. Essentially, the region is being reshaped by a massive transport corridor a little over 1,300 miles long, intended to bind the whole peninsula together into one connected logistics network. As of 2026, the full network still isn't up and running. This is an extremely complex international project, with each country moving at its own pace and dealing with its own bureaucratic and financial hurdles. The line was originally supposed to launch much earlier, but the timeline has been pushed back several times. At this point, the realistic target for completing the full end-to-end system from Kuwait to Oman is roughly 2028 to 2030. The good news is that several major pieces of the puzzle are already finished and operating within individual countries. Saudi Arabia, for example, has already built hundreds of miles of domestic track. The UAE completed its Etihad rail freight network in 2023, and the Hafid rail link toward Oman, which we just mentioned, is now actively under construction, with crews actively excavating and laying the tracks. Other sections, such as the rail bridge between Saudi Arabia and Bahrain and the line into Qatar, are still in the design and detailed planning stages. Why did the Gulf states decide to pour billions of dollars into these railways in the first place? It all comes down to basic economics. Right now, if Saudi Arabia or Kuwait needs to bring in massive volumes of goods from Asia, cargo ships have to sail deep into the Persian Gulf. And as we know, the Gulf is a fairly unstable region. But once the entire rail network is finally connected into one loop, the rules of the game will change dramatically. The UAE, with its direct access to the Indian Ocean, will automatically become the main gateway for transit trade. Ships will unload on the Emirates' east coast. Cargo will move through mountain tunnels to the Al Thid dry port for rapid sorting, and from there, trains will distribute it across the entire peninsula. As a result, a container could reach a city like Riyadh by rail in just 1 or 2 days, instead of spending a full week at sea as the ship makes its way around the peninsula through risky maritime zones. And to make sure trains can cross borders without friction, the Arab states agreed in advance on strict unified technical standards. The entire route uses standard gauge track, 5 feet, trains run on powerful diesel locomotives, and safety is handled by a modern European signaling system. The idea was to make sure that, say, a train from the UAE could enter Saudi Arabia's rail network smoothly with no technical compatibility issues. At the borders themselves, the plan's also to introduce a unified digital customs system so trains don't spend hours sitting idle while paperwork is checked. In the end, the dry port in Al Thid is gradually evolving from a simple local facility in the desert into one of the key hubs of a vast international network. The UAE has deliberately moved ahead of the curve, while neighboring countries are still completing their cross-border rail sections. The Emirates has already put its domestic backbone in place, and once this massive web of rail lines is finally connected, logistics across the Middle East will begin operating along entirely new routes. It's also important to note that the Al Udeid region itself is heading for major change. Once the dry port in the desert is fully operational and begins expanding, the entire area around it will inevitably start filling out with powerful new infrastructure. Being close to a railway station acts like a magnet for businesses of all kinds. New industrial parks and logistics zones are almost certain to spring up around the hub. For major retailers and manufacturers, it'll make perfect sense to build distribution centers, sorting warehouses, and packaging facilities right next to the tracks, allowing them to intercept cargo as soon as it comes off the train. Over time, the area could also attract assembly plants, container service yards, and massive wholesale hubs. The passenger station in Al Udeid has also been officially confirmed, which means the area won't just see freight trains, passenger trains will arrive here as well. And once business moves in, everyday urban life will follow. Wherever thousands of employees, transit workers, and train crews are working around the clock, there will inevitably be demand for new residential neighborhoods, gas stations, vehicle service centers, and hotels. The quiet oasis of Al Udeid has every chance of eventually becoming a large, noisy, and lively industrial city. That raises an important question. When will the Al Udeid dry port actually be completed? As of 2026, the new logistics hub is still at the very starting point. The Sharjah government and the contractor have only just launched the design phase, allocating more than $100 million for the first stage. There are no official deadlines yet for the turnkey completion, as the project is still very new, but given its strategic importance, construction is unlikely to be delayed for long. And once this giant site covering more than 250 acres is fully completed, it will change a great deal. The hub will become the country's main distribution center beyond the mountains, receiving, sorting, and forwarding millions of tons of critical cargo and containers arriving from the East Coast. Ultimately, the UAE will gain a powerful overland buffer that will help shield the entire region's logistics systems from disruptions in the Strait of Hormuz.